All right. Oops, we'll get that out of the way. All right. Welcome, everyone who has joined us to the presentation from Response to Recovery to Rebuild for the Charitable Sector with Marco Paganini, President and CEO of the Ottawa Community Foundation, and we will begin shortly. If this is the session where you want to be, thank you for joining us. If you are looking for a different session, please take a look at the navigation on the left side of your screen, and you can find the other sessions that are running right now. Otherwise, we look very forward to having you here, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining PSHSA's The Workplace Reimagined Virtual Conference. My name is Tanya Morose, and I am the Manager of Prevention, Engagement, and Retention for the Public Safety Sector at PSHSA. I am very pleased to welcome you to this session from Response to Recovery to Rebuild for the Charitable Sector, presented by Marco Paganini, President and CEO of the Ottawa Community Foundation. Before we begin, I want to mention that there will be an opportunity to answer questions. We're going to have a fireside chat. So if you can type your questions in the chat bar as we go, I will either politely interrupt Marco to let him know about your challenges, or we'll save them for the end. We'll see how it goes. With the dramatic spread of COVID-19, we've seen disruptions in the lives, the livelihoods, communities, and organizations everywhere. Not-for-profit organizations are at a great risk of losing private funding and public support. That being said, there have been leadership responses which have enabled some organizations to survive and thrive throughout the pandemic. As a seasoned and respected leader in both the corporate and not-for-profit sectors, Marco began his career with Nortel Networks in 1985, progressively working his way through the ranks over close to 2 decades to president of a number of Nortel business units, from managing more than 2,000 employees and over $1 billion in revenue in that capacity to serving as chair and CEO of various successful startups. As president of the Ottawa Community Foundation, Marco has set and met a series of ambitious targets for the organization, including bringing in close to $25 million in his first year, as well as improving the foundation's brand, profile, and reputation for innovation. We're pleased to welcome Marco, who will share how he reacted to the unprecedented challenges brought on by the pandemic and how they have been able to respond, recover, and rebuild effectively. Hello, thank you for joining us, Marco, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Tanya, and welcome everybody, and good afternoon. I think it's afternoon wherever you are. It's certainly close to afternoon, late morning here in Ottawa, Canada, where I'm speaking from. Response to recovery to rebuild is what this is entitled. And it's really an attempt to provide a perspective on what the sector is struggling with and what the opportunities moving forward are. I'm going to start with an expression, a statement that I believe has always been true and continues to be true, just to set some context for this discussion. And by the way, as Tanya said, I don't mind being interrupted and making this more of an interactive fireside chat. So again, if you do have questions, please use your chat box to send them in, and I'll do my best to respond in real time. Fault lines have always existed in social systems and other systems related to social infrastructure. And these fault lines sometimes are dormant or not perceivable when things are kind of going well, but when systems get stressed, fault lines get exposed. So that's the starting point for this discussion. The pandemic has certainly stressed the social infrastructure systems, and fault lines have been readily exposed. And the whole notion of migrating from response to recovery to rebuild is really an attempt to collectively address fault lines and re-architect social infrastructures so that, you know, we're better equipped next time those systems are stressed. That's really the bottom line in terms of what we're trying to contribute to as an organization and as a sector. I like starting these kinds of talks with what is the Ottawa Community Foundation? Community foundations are a global movement. They started over 100 years ago. They are at least two things. They are funders of the charitable sector in their local communities, and they are the fulfillers of philanthropists' philanthropic journeys. So in other words, they are the alternative to philanthropists setting up their own private foundations. So typically, philanthropists will donate money to a community foundation. They will set up a fund. Those dollars will be invested by the community foundation to yield a return on the investment. And then the assets are used to mobilize into the charitable sector in order to further social good, is typically what community foundations do. There's 18 or 1900 of them in the world. And in Canada, we have 191, and we represent over 90% of the communities in Canada. And in Ottawa, we are now quite a significant player. We've become one of, if not the biggest funder of the charitable sector in our city. We've been on a trajectory to evolve from what I refer to as an in-the-background grant maker and an occasional convener into a city builder and a thought leader. And it started with a brand promise when I started in this vocation. I refer to it as a vocation 7 years ago. And our brand promise was to be seen in the community as a most trusted partner, if not the most trusted partner, to fulfill what we refer to as impact philanthropy, philanthropy that delivers positive, systemic, sustainable change. So big words. What do they mean? Well, they mean the following. Pursuing the following three guiding principles, not only as an organization, but encouraging these guiding principles in the sector. And those guiding principles are: number one, evidence-based decision-making approaches. Number two, systems-oriented orientations around solutions. And number three, the formalization of cross-sectoral partnerships, which I refer to as PPP. Everybody's heard of the public sector and the private sector, and I refer to our sector as the philanthropic sector. In Canada, the philanthropic sector encompasses 170,000 individual organizations that are charities and or not-for-profits. And that translates to, at least prior to the pandemic, over 2 million employees, over 7 million volunteers, over 8.2% of the GDP. And the notion is that these problems that we're all trying to solve are literally world hunger problems, and I'm going to get into that in a second, but it requires a coordinated mobilization of resources across all sectors in order to truly move the needle on these issue areas. So positive, systemic, sustainable change is really following those three guiding principles to ultimately contribute to the creation of social infrastructure, which again facilitates positive movements in the solution space. And for me, the problem that we're trying to solve is to affect in a positive way socioeconomic indicators at a population level. So again, big words, what the heck do they mean? Well, I'll give you the Ottawa scenario. In Ottawa, we have 1,800 charities, 1,800 charities. We have 1 million people in our city. We have over 60,000 households that suffer some form of food insecurity. So they don't have access to healthy, affordable, culturally appropriate food. We have 42,000 monthly users of food banks. We have 12,000 households that are on a waiting list for affordable housing. We have 7,500 annual users of emergency shelters. We have 13.1% youth unemployment. And by the way, these were the numbers prior to the pandemic hitting in March. So those numbers are only worse. So when we talk about positive systemic sustainable change and social infrastructure and systems approaches to solving problems and cross-sectoral partnerships, it's really building anything and everything to warrant a coordinated mobilization of resources across all sectors so that we can ultimately drive those bad numbers to zero. And if it's a good number, to 100%. And being in vocation mode, I can honestly say, my view is none of us should rest until the bad numbers are zero and the good numbers are at 100%. So the pandemic hits, what happens? Well, we get into emergency response mode right away. There's more need, there's heightened need, there's acute need. The sector scrambles in order to be able to, not only handle the numbers that I just communicated, but an ever increasing numbers in each of the social issue areas that we live in and day out, whether it's, affordable housing or food insecurity or poverty reduction or mental health or opioid addiction crises or violence against the most vulnerable or systemic racism. All the issue areas get amplified during a pandemic. And we introduced very quickly this frame of response to recovery to rebuild as a result of the pandemic, which was really our attempt to be agile and nimble, but to continue to be bigger, faster, stronger on all the things that we try to facilitate with this orientation around positive systemic sustainable change. So to be very specific, I think we were notified in Ottawa of the pandemic hitting around March the 12th, if I remember correctly, which was a Saturday. March the 13th, which was a Sunday, I had an emergency meeting with my management team. March the 14th, we pulled out all the stops and created the infrastructure in order to facilitate business continuity so that we can get money in really quickly and money out really quickly electronically, because in-person meetings was no longer an option. And by the end of that first week, we actually launched, and I believe we were the first, if not one of the early adopters of the mobilization of something called the Rapid Response Fund. So we created a Rapid Response Fund within a week, and we started rolling out money almost immediately. And then we started working with other funders like the municipality and the United Way, and we made ourselves ultra available and nimble to the 1,800 charities. We work with the federal government to instantiate other programs for funding, including something called the Emergency Community Support Fund, which was a $350 million national fund by the federal government in order to help with the pandemic response within the sector nationally. We work with corporate donors that would have never otherwise come to us to facilitate assistance and contribution. And when you fast forward to, the end of October or so, this time frame, we've given out over $5 million in response to the pandemic. That's remarkable because that's $5 million above and beyond the money we would typically give out anyway. And last year we gave out about $15 million as a foundation to our local community. We brought in, most of that money was totally brand new money. So we have fantastic donors that facilitate asset growth in order to orient giving in a positive, systemic, sustainable change kind of a way. And they stepped up even beyond what they've been stepping up over the last 7 years. We've more than doubled our assets in the last 6 years from the previous 27 or 28 years at the foundation because of the generosity of donors. But they stepped up even above and beyond that in order to equip us to be able to nimbly and in an agile way inject dollars quickly to the sector so that we could treat our most vulnerable. So $5 million, we probably hit around 250 charities immediately with new money. We've impacted tens of thousands of Ottawa citizens and visitors as a direct result of quickly mobilizing rapid response dollars. So the response part of the response, recovery, rebuild was primarily driven by that, by the creation, the agility, the engagement of the sector in order to inject, again, around $5 million of new money. And that's only the Ottawa Community Foundation contribution. The United Way, the Red Cross, and others worked with the feds, and local food banks worked with Food Banks of Canada, and other organizations worked with their national counterparts in order to mobilize other dollars. So I didn't count them all up, but it's tens of millions of dollars that were injected in our city and in a number of cities across our country. The really cool thing that happened during the response was some of the sector thinking beyond the immediate response. And some of it was as a result of us orienting the sector in this kind of social infrastructure, systems oriented kind of a way, but some of it was their own ingenuity and innovation in order to start leveraging things, including guiding principles that we had professed in the past, whether they heard it from us or not. And one of my favorite examples was there was a local charity that had a net cafe implementation in one of our most marginalized communities in our city. So they were offering internet service and some food bank distribution capabilities to a local neighborhood. And when the pandemic hit, they realized very quickly that a big hole, so again, one of these fault lines that was exposed in our social infrastructure around food systems, was responding to marginalized people that didn't have access to kitchen facilities. So of the 7,500 annual shelter users, the estimate is between 1,000 and 2,000 of them are actually in shelters like converted motels and other places where they don't have access to kitchen facilities. So food for thought, with some early funding from us, and then we gave them a bunch of other money, a couple $100,000, I think, over the period of the pandemic, reached out to local restaurateurs and others, including a Fairmont hotel, who made their commercial kitchen available. So they were basically a perfect example of what we refer to as public-private philanthropic relationships. And they basically, on the fly, created infrastructure to leverage all these assets across all sectors to deliver hot meal service during the pandemic. And at last count, they had delivered over 90,000 hot meals to residents in Ottawa that were living in these conditions, which is an unbelievable number. The Ottawa Community Foundation's contribution to that was not only money, but we worked really closely with them to figure out how to facilitate sustaining that, because depending on grant money forever was not a sustainable model. We certainly encouraged the leveraging of those cross-sectoral partnerships and maybe brought a few others into that ecosystem. But probably the most important contribution we made was acknowledging and getting them to acknowledge that in order for this to be truly an example of positive systemic sustainable change, we needed to find a way to embed this service into the food infrastructure beyond the pandemic. So we're now working with them, with private industry and with others. We're helping them develop social enterprises so that they can earn revenue, not just give out free meals based on grant money, and a few other things in order to ensure that this hot meal delivery service becomes a permanent systems infrastructure play when it comes to food. And I can give other examples where we're doing similar things around a bunch of mental health providers converging on a standardized software platform so that they were all working in a collective, coordinated way when it comes to dealing with mental health and addictions-oriented issues, or with 200 of the 1,800 charities being in the food acquisition and food distribution business, working in a more collective way and injecting capital in order to build, again, permanent social infrastructure so that the food services delivery is more of a sustainable thing versus a response to a tactical emergency where total dependency on grant money is maybe a way to do it in the emergency phase or in the response phase, but it's certainly not the way to do it in the recovery phase. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of color on what does it mean to go from response to recovery. And for me, response to recovery really means figuring out how to create permanency around some of these really cool products and services that the sector delivers, and to bake them formally into a social infrastructure so that they'll be there well beyond the end of the pandemic. And I know it will end. When we talk about rebuild, so we talked a little bit about response, a little bit about recovery. My very strong opinion on rebuild is that we're going to need to really turn things upside down to rebuild the social infrastructure in a way that we truly address the fault lines that exist. And, you know, some examples that I think everybody would resonate is look at what's happening in Canada in the long-term care facility space. You know, I think 85% plus of the deaths in Canada as a result of COVID have happened in long-term care facilities. So that's obviously an infrastructure that's wrought with fault lines, and a reimagining and a redesigning of that associated infrastructure is warranted. So when I talk about rebuild, I think about my former days as a Fortune 100 CEO and primarily in the telecommunications space. And I think about telecom networks or transportation networks or other infrastructures where hundreds of millions of human hours of effort were put into creating these always on resilient networks. So for example, a telecom network that's been around for over 100 years used to be designed to facilitate voice calls, and then people started doing data kind of transactions, and then they evolved to video. And with 5G coming, God only knows what the network's going to do. It'll facilitate, you know, autonomous vehicles and smart appliances and other things in our present and future. So my view is, if we, in order to build that always on resilient, multi-100 million human hours of effort into infrastructures like telecom networks and transportation networks, why don't we be deliberate about applying those same paradigms in the social infrastructure? So the example I use is food systems. So in Ottawa, again, I think I said it, but I'll say it again, 200 of the 1,800 charities are in the food acquisition business. So they acquire food and they distribute food to marginalized people in our city. So that means we have 200 organizations worth of volume purchasing power. Imagine we implemented social infrastructure that included the centralization of food purchasing so that we could achieve a 40% reduction in food costs. When you think about a food system is actually beyond food acquisition. It's food processing, it's food distribution, and it's food recovery or waste management. And when I did my back of the envelope calculation, we could get a 70 to 80% reduction if we actually created social infrastructure which facilitated coordination across all the players in the food system, from food acquisition to food processing, to food distribution, to food recovery. Then imagine overlaying on top of that partnerships with professional food players, the Farm Boys, the Metros, the Loblaws of the world, where we brought world-class expertise around centralized food hubs and distribution hubs and processing hubs and waste recovery hubs. Imagine what the impact would be if we rebuilt the social infrastructure that transcended all the sectors. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about rebuild. So in my conclusion is the sector can vary, and we have demonstrated an ability without relying on too much outside help in responding, even to a certain extent in recovering. But if we're serious about eliminating fault lines, then rebuilding is going to warrant outside expertise. And we need to be deliberate in facilitating a cross-sectoral collective impact approach to rebuilding systems so that fault lines disappear. So It's 5 to 12. I said I would talk about 20 minutes or so. I think it's been about 20 or 22 minutes. But I wanted to end there. Hopefully that's a little bit of food for thought, excuse the pun, because that's the organization that I referred to earlier, to warrant some kind of discussion and interaction and Q&A around, how we see the sector playing a role in facilitating, transcending a continuum that goes from response to recovery to rebuild. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Marco. To all our guests, if you do have a question, you can type it in the chat, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. Just give me 1 minute here while I move a couple windows around so we can still keep that there. If there are questions, please don't hesitate to type there in the chat. There we go. Share that. There we go. All right. I think I've got all my ducks in a row here. I can see. Yes, I can see the chat. All righty. Thank you, Marco, for sharing the success story from the Ottawa Community Foundation of pivotal responsiveness, recovery, and rebuilding. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts. A similar theme emerged in the earlier session in this stream around fault lines being identified in our social infrastructure and our social fabric as we support those who maybe are marginalized or more vulnerable in our community. And I know that we have all had to overcome, in some cases, some very significant challenges with respect to not just surviving, but also thriving in the pandemic. I'm wondering if you could share from your perspective as a senior leader in the philanthropic sector, have there been any hidden or unexpected benefits or blessings that have come out of the challenging times that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, good question. So I'm going to start by suggesting that there's some national umbrella organizations that try to represent the sector. And when you look at the information they've provided, the estimate at the start of the pandemic was that between 5 and 20% of the philanthropic sector would get hit significantly, including some of those organizations that I talked about that made up 8.2% of the GDP of Canada would disappear. And we've seen at least 1 or 2 of those things happen in Ottawa. To me, the part that isn't surprising was how quickly the sector mobilized to be able to rapidly respond. The part that wasn't surprising was how quickly donors stepped up in order to help us create a rapid response fund and flow dollars really, really quickly so that those consuming the dollars could rapidly respond. What I was hoping for, wasn't sure would happen, but happened and therefore was a bit of a surprise, were a few things. One was how quickly the government responded and made programs and funding dollars available. And I referred to part of the complements to the Rapid Response Fund was the Emergency Community Support Fund, right? It's not every day that within weeks of an emergency hitting that the federal government can mobilize $350 million across the country, engage national intermediaries, and then flow those dollars from the national intermediaries to the local funders like us, and then in turn flow those dollars to the agencies on the front lines. So that was a very, very nice, pleasant surprise. More of a pleasant surprise for me, and I used food for thought as an example. I used the coming together of the local coalition of mental health providers as an example, where people were actually on their own fulfilling our dream of creating positive systemic sustainable change, of leveraging cross-sectoral partnerships, of orienting things around systems approaches, around, investing in social infrastructure elements that had some permanency to them. So I refer to all that stuff as kind of the bigger, faster, stronger of what we've always tried to represent in the sector. So that was, for me, the most pleasant and impactful surprise of all. So I want to make sure that we continue to take advantage of the momentum that maybe part of it we contributed to prior to the pandemic. We certainly encouraged during the pandemic, but in many ways was instantiated without our involvement at all, because people are just smart and innovative and they figure things out when things are tough. So I just want us to accentuate that wave and ride that wave and pump as much wind into the sails as possible so that we can fulfill that, again, bigger, faster, stronger. I refer to all of that stuff as thoughtful recovery. So we're actually now looking at mobilizing dollars in a thoughtful recovery kind of a way beyond the rapid response, initial response to the pandemic. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Now thinking about, as we move from that initial crisis response to that thoughtful and longer term recovery, what do you see from your perspective, and thinking about speaking to other senior leaders in community type organizations? What do you see as the logical next step or next steps as we think about recovery and longer term sustainable change that might address some of the challenges that were brought to light or accentuated through the more crisis phase?
Yeah, and again, thank you for the question. This is kind of an extension of what we were already working on prior to the pandemic. So I have this really strong view that, cross-sectoral partnerships are a must, but they imply that they need to be led by one of the sectors. So you can't just say invest in social infrastructure in a coordinated kind of a way without a lead sector offering the coordinating work. And in a collective impact, which is a framework for doing things together, there's this notion of backbone organizations, which are kind of these overarching coordinating entities. So it's going to be a bit of a long answer to your very short question, which is very typical of me, but I want to make sure people understand what we're talking about. The first thing we got to do in order to ensure the philanthropic sector could lead the cross-sectoral charge, and by the way, the reason I think they need to lead it, we need to lead it, is because we're the ones closest to the people that the social infrastructure serves. So it's not because we're any bigger hearted or smarter or anything else, although I think we're big hearted and I hope we're smart, but we have that intimate connection to the people that are being served. I gave a bunch of numbers, 60,000, 42,000, 12,000, 7,500, 13.1%. Those are not just numbers, they're people. They're faces, right? They're hearts, they're souls. And the philanthropic sector touches those faces, hearts, and souls every single day. So I think that is a good criteria for suggesting the philanthropic sector has a leadership role in the mobilization of cross-sectoral solutions. So that's kind of the first comment. The second comment is the sector, even prior to the pandemic, so I've been in it now in a vocation mode for 7 years, and I said this 7 years ago, and it's more true today than it's ever been. The sector is very much big-hearted. In very many cases, big-brained, but in general, heads down, running from fire to fire. And the fires only got bigger during the pandemic. So breaking that kind of perpetual firefighting cycle, which, by the way, is accentuated by total dependence on grant money, actually has created a sector which, again, big-hearted, big-brained, but heads down, running from fire to fire with total dependence on grants. And the good news about the pandemic was a lot of extra grant money, like the $350 million from the feds, came around. The bad news is that it could potentially contribute to more dependence on grant money, not less dependence on grant money. So to answer your question now specifically, Tanya, our very strong opinion prior to the pandemic and even stronger during the pandemic is part of our positive systemic sustainable orientation needs to include lessening dependence on grant money for the sector so that the sector could sustain itself, so that when it's sustainable, it could actually lead across sectoral social infrastructure coordination in order to drive socioeconomic indicators in the right direction. So our solution to that is the alternative to grant money is earned revenue. Our solution to earned revenue is social enterprise and the associated development, including social finance. And our solution to social enterprise development and social finance capacity building is the creation of social infrastructure locally that has actually encouraged the contributions of service providers across all sectors into our sector to help with business case development, with marketing, with branding, with selling, with policy management, with incubating social innovation, with presence at our innovation center, and I can name off a bunch of other things, which has actually yielded prior to the pandemic 150 new social enterprises in our 1,800 charity ecosystem. So a next step is bigger, faster, stronger on social enterprise development, on social finance, leverage on minimizing the dependence on grant money. So that's a big ticket item, and an equally big ticket item is taking advantage of the circumstances to promote more of these cross-sectoral partnerships, like the example of food for thought and restaurateurs and commercial kitchens from big hotels, et cetera. And then the third one would be this orientation around permanent social infrastructure investment. I call them platforms. And again, a good example of that would be the coalition of mental health providers converging on a standardized platform for intake and then management of mental health, I'll call them victims. I hope that's an appropriate word, but people that are suffering from mental health. As a result of the pandemic and some of our orientation around promoting positive systemic sustainable change, we invested $100,000 to that coalition, and now they're standardizing on a software platform, which is going to facilitate not having people falling through the gaps. Because when you didn't have a standardized intake methodology and platform, people were falling through the cracks. So there's an example of fault lines being plugged up with a systems-oriented approach. So those are at least three things, Tanya, that I would immediately jump on, and we have jumped on.
All righty. Thank you, Marco. And in our last 5 minutes or so, just wondering, as we have gone through this pandemic and in your role as a senior leader, not only in your organization, but working with the philanthropic sector and all those community support and charity organizations, what is the top lesson that you have learned as a senior leader, or what piece of advice could you pass on to others in leadership positions as a result of having gone through this journey?
Yeah, I don't know whether I learned it or whether I thought it before or I knew it before, but I'm a bit of a seasoned leader, right? Running big multi-billion-dollar multinational companies and working with the biggest venture capitalists and private equity firms in the world, you kind of learn some stuff.
For sure.
So whether I learned it before, or I learned it here, or I elevated my learning as a result of my contribution in this vocation, I'm going to say a few things. First, stay humble. I keep reminding people, especially our sector, that at the end of the day, all we do is write the checks. You guys, the 1,800 charities in Ottawa, the 170,000 organizations in Canada, the philanthropic sector, are the ones that are doing the work. So we need to be sufficiently humble as funders, first of all, to recognize that we're just writing the checks. We might provide some thought leadership, perhaps, but at the end of the day, the execution is in the hands of the people in the front lines. I think the frontline people need to exhibit some humility, although in general, the sector does God's work, is the way some people represent it. Bringing multiple lenses to the solution space, including public policy lenses and private industry business case lenses and value proposition articulation lenses, can only help us do our jobs better. But more importantly than that, it facilitates the opting in of the other sectors because we're actually bringing their lenses into our space. So I think that's a learning that I believe I've always known, but I think it got accentuated during this whole exercise. So humility from funders, but humility from the rest of the sector. And then a recognition and an acknowledgement that, doing this, and this again, I don't know whether it's a new learning or not, but what's the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing and expecting different results. We've been around about 100 years as a sector, and those socioeconomic indicators that I suggest is our primary raison d'etre to drive in a positive direction have been going in the wrong direction for 100 years. So maybe acknowledging that we can't do it as individual organizations because we are a very siloed sector. We can't even do it as a coordinated sector. We need the mobilization and the coordination across all the sectors. I hope that's the biggest learning. And my view is I think I've known it, but that's what I would try to impart to all the other leaders because these are literally world hunger problems. The stats I gave in Ottawa are terrible for developing countries, let alone for the capital city of the greatest nation, a G7 country in the world, right? So that's what I would say.
All righty. Thank you so much, Marco, for sharing. And I realize that, yes, there are things that maybe we've known all along or we learned somewhere else, but there's in this time of initial crisis and response and as we get months into this, that certain reminders of what's important and how we need to think about things differently in order to thrive and address some of those faults that have been identified as we have come through